So guys, I have been playing Dragons Dogma 2 and I have a lot of thoughts. Now this video is my first impressions and it's not going to be considered as a full review. I'll be going over my initial impressions, some pros, some cons, as I do think for a lot of people that are still on the fence on whether or not they should buy Dragons Dogma 2, maybe this video will help you make that decision. Also, a big thank you to Capcom for providing me with a code for review. The second it hit my inbox, I dropped literally everything I was doing and I jumped on Dragons Dogma 2. And man, for fans of the series, I can tell you this much right now. They pulled it off. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of pros and there are some negatives just from my first impressions. So I'll be talking about that and more. Check the video chapters for easy viewing. Also, I'm giving away 2 copies of Dragons Dogma 2. If you would like to win, check the pinned comment or stick around until the end of the video for those details. So now for the first part of this video, I want to talk about most of my experiences with the overall gameplay. We're going to talk about a lot of positives here. So we're going to start the video off with a really positive note. Dragons Dogma 2 is effectively how it's been marketed to us this entire time. A single player narrative driven action RPG, and that's what it is. If you played the first Dragons Dogma game, it's essentially the ultimate Dragons Dogma experience. It takes everything that the first game did right and just does it better. For instance, with the gameplay, it's basically the first game with better visuals. The open world is vast and it instantly immerses you. There's 2 countries, the first one being Vermund and then the second one being Batal. Dragons Dogma 2 features an intriguing story and it definitely feels like they put more of an effort on the narrative this time around. The gameplay does an amazing job at setting the stage beautifully. Everything from the characters you'll encounter to the mythical beasts that you will eventually be fighting. You also get a sense of scale of the overall open world fairly quickly. I think new players of the Dragons Dogma series are going to play the intro and immediately be hooked from not only the story but also the gameplay. Also, if you plan on playing Dragons Dogma 2, I strongly recommend waiting to watch any playthroughs, especially of the introduction. You're going to want to experience that yourself because in my opinion, it really is that good. Now with DD2 being such a large game, it is a big game, and one of the pre-launch concerns was that the game doesn't feature a traditional fast traveling system, and what I'll say about that is the traveling doesn't feel tedious. As Itsuno said prior to the release, traveling is fun, and when you make traveling around the map a fun experience, fast travel isn't needed. And from my time playing DD2, I think that is indeed the case. Like, you'll be playing and just walking around and then immediately get ambushed by, let's say, a bunch of goblins, and then once you kill those goblins, about 35 or 40 seconds later, you'll be in another fight. Now that's not saying that you're not going to be able to travel quickly. It's not the Pokemon tall grass situation where you're walking through tall grass and then you immediately get encounters. It's not like that. The encounters do feel super organic. You can kind of see them coming, and then from there you can kind of make a decision on whether or not to keep going down that path and fighting the goblins or whatever else is there, or you could just walk in the same direction a little bit over to the right or left where they can't see you, and thus allowing you to keep going on your journey through that path. It really is like just completely your choice. Now one thing that I will say about traveling throughout the world, you do have the ability to jog, but you can jog as much as you want and that won't deplete your stamina. But if you decide to sprint, it will eventually deplete your stamina. And when I tell you, once you deplete your stamina, it legit sounds like your character's about to die. Like, dude, your character gets out of breath, your controller starts shaking, and you think like, dude, I'm about to black out. But then one of your pawns comes up to you and gives you more stamina, allowing you to continue on like normal. Moving right along, let's go ahead and talk about the pawns. So initially, the pawns are great. It definitely feels like this is how Itsuno originally intended the pawns to play with Dragons Dogma 1. The pawns play to their vocation in Dragons Dogma 2 in such a great way. It feels like every single pawn is playing their vocation correctly. They aren't constantly in your way like other games with party systems. And to reiterate on my previous point, because of the improved AI, the pawns play better to their vocation in DD2, which I think that alone is a massive improvement from Dragons Dogma 1. And I think it's going to be really exciting. Once you guys play, you'll see for yourself. Another thing that I think is an awesome addition is there's a lot of chatter in between the pawns, which it makes you feel like you're in a party. If you've ever played a game like, let's say, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that game does a really good job at the discussions in between different characters. Granted, a lot of those are named characters that have a history of dialogue in between them, so it's a lot easier to have discussions in a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth compared to in Dragons Dogma 2 because of the sheer amount of pawns that there are. So yeah, whenever you're playing, expect a lot of chatter in between them. You'll get complimented, you'll start dapping each other up, and you just really feel like you're the Arisen. Every time you dap up one of your pawns, you've got the exaggerated swagger of the Arisen, and it just gives me goosebumps every single time it happens, especially after you just took down a group of enemies. And can we talk about the voice acting? Dude, the voice acting in this game is phenomenal. Everything from the pawns to the named characters. This game, like the first game, did a great job with the voice acting. So yeah, major kudos to the team over at Capcom for nailing down the voice acting. So now let's talk about the overall graphics graphics. We're going to talk about the performance in the next section of this video. You definitely don't want to miss out on that aspect because there are some negatives, so stick around for that. Now, overall, the graphics in Dragons Dogma 2 are a major step up from the first game, with this game being 12 years after the original. If you put the two together, they look like completely different experiences. It definitely seems like Dragons Dogma 2 is taking the RE engine to the absolute max with this game, not only with the massive open world, but also just the visual quality. Now, the default settings had motion blur enabled. I immediately turned that off, so minus 10 points to Gryffindor for having that option on. Now, there was a lot of graphic options. There was a couple missing that I'm really disappointed about that I'll talk about soon. Yeah, from a graphical standpoint, game looks great. Now, another question of concern that I've seen is the enemy variety, and what I'll say about that is I didn't really get enough time to really judge that. As I play the game, I'm sure I'll have a different opinion, but so far from the first about 8 hours of the game, the enemy variety I thought was fine. You will run into a lot of goblins, but it's typically not like back-to-back creatures that you fight. So like I said, from my time played, it seems like the variety is fine, but I could totally see my opinion changing as I play the game. Now, on the Dragons Dogma 2 website, there's about 21 monsters listed. I'm sure there's probably more, but if you're concerned about the overall enemy variety, at least for the first 8 hours of the game, it's perfectly fine. So the next section of this video will be mainly covering some of the performance related concerns. These are most of the cons that I had from the game, because at this current time, Dragons Dogma 2 on PC is not very consistent. Now, I do want to give a disclaimer that Capcom said that they do have plans to improve the performance, so whether that means that it will happen on launch or not is kind of a toss-up. My guess is that they are actively focusing on a performance update to make sure that Dragons Dogma 2 is as stable as possible and performs as good as possible on PC day one. And for another disclaimer, I am using a GPU encoded capture software, so that could be some of the reasons why the FPS isn't as consistent. However, I am using a pretty solid machine. For the purposes of this review, I was using an Intel i7-10700K CPU. Now, for the CPU clock speed, I believe I'm using XMP. I don't think I've really adjusted anything from there on this CPU, but either way, it's plenty enough for modern gaming. My rig has 32 gigabytes of RAM, and I'm also using an M.2 drive for the actual game install. For my graphics card, I'm using an RTX 4090. I was playing the game on high to medium settings. There is ray tracing enabled. However, the overall frame rate didn't really change much with RTX on or off. And for the last little disclaimer, I am not a tech guru. Guys, if you want a full in-depth analysis, check out the Digital Foundry video. I'm sure they have one live on their channel. I'm sure you'll get a lot more out of that video than you will with my performance review. So let's go ahead and get into it. Like I said, performance is not very consistent on PC. Dragons Dogma 2 does feature FSR 3 and DLSS, but the unfortunate part about this is it does not have any of the frame generation technology. It doesn't have fluid frames with FSR, and it does not use frame generation with DLSS 3 or 3.5. So that part right there is kind of annoying. I was really hoping the Dragons Dogma 2 would feature some form of DLSS frame generation because I've got a 4090 and I want to utilize it. So here's to hoping a mod developer releases a DLSS frame generation or FSR fluid frame mod after the launch of the game. But at the moment, Dragons Dogma 2 does not have any type of frame generation technology. So Capcom, if you're listening to this video, give us DLSS frame gen or FSR 3 fluid frames. We really would like that because I'm sure it would help a lot in some of the more CPU intensive areas with low FPS. And the FPS outside of larger points of interest is pretty solid. You get about 60, sometimes 70, 75, 80. It really depends on the circumstances. Usually whenever there's large creatures on the screen, the FPS is pretty consistent actually. However, whenever you go to larger points of interest, I can't really tell the names of those, but the frame rate is pretty much dead. And I'm guessing this is one of the reasons why the frame rate is indeed uncapped on the console, because whenever you're outside of a point of interest that's large, you get about 60 to 70 FPS, but as soon as you get into that large point of interest, you get about 30 to 35, sometimes even lower than 30 FPS performance in those larger points of interest, which I personally think is totally unacceptable. And I'm guessing that this is the part that Capcom is focusing on the most. I'm really hoping that we get a frame generation mod shortly after launch that will kind of act as a band-aid in some of those larger POIs. But at the current moment, the biggest problem with Dragons Dogma 2 is indeed the performance. Now, obviously, this is just my personal experience with the performance of Dragons Dogma 2. Things could totally be different depending on the hardware. Like I said, I'm using a pretty beefy machine and I was having issues. And as I said before, for an in-depth analysis, go check out other channels that are more tech focused like Digital Foundry. So to kind of bring everything back in with all of the negatives and performance issues aside, from my experience with Dragons Dogma 2, I am having a good time. I played the first game, loved that game, and Dragons Dogma 2 is just more of that and better. So I am personally satisfied. So whether or not that is enough for you to be satisfied is totally up to you, because this is at the end of the day just one person's opinion. opinion. Either way though, guys, let me know what your thoughts are on Dragons Dogma 2. Do you plan on picking it up? Did this review sell you? Let me know down in the comment section below, guys. Do me a favor, hit the like button if you've enjoyed. Also, if you want to win a copy of Dragons Dogma 2, it's super easy. All you have to do is subscribe to the channel, comment your Twitter handle or your Discord, and then tweet me or post proof that you're subscribed, and that will enter you for a chance to win a copy of Dragons Dogma 2. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, this has been Wes, and I will talk to you guys in the next video.